When Roby was 12, Rabindranath went on a trip to North India and took the boy with him. The last stop on a long tour was the rest house on Bakrota, the highest hill in the hill station of Dalhousie in the Punjab. Roby was told by his father to roam about on his own. He was also taught to rise before the sun. And to handle money and keep accounts. The days often ended with a boy singing devotional songs to his father. Roby was 13 when his first book of verse, Kobi Kahini, came out. When Roby was 16, Rabindranath brought out a literary magazine called Bharati, and Roby found an admirable platform for his literary activities. The essays included pieces on European poets like Dante and Petrarch, whose acquaintance Roby had made in Ahmedabad, in the library of his elder brother Shotendranath. Shotendranath's wife, Ganadhanandini, who was staying in England with her 2 children, was a remarkable woman who had been persuaded by her husband to come out of orthodox seclusion. Roby set out for England in the summer of 1878 and joined Ganadhanandini in Brighton. If the plan was to provide the boy with a proper education, it came to naught, for Roby returned without completing his course of studies at the London University. While in England, Rabindranath had become acquainted with Western music. Some of the tunes he had learned found their way into his enchanting opera, Valmiki Pratibha.
ওই ঘোর মস্তকারে নিত্য রঙ্গ মাঝারে ওই লক্ষ লক্ষ যক্ষ লক্ষ ঘেরি শ্যামারে ওই লাট্ট পাট্ট কেশ অট্ট অট্ট হাসে রে হা 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 আরে বল রে শ্যামা মায়ের জয় 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 আরে বল রে শ্যামা মায়ের জয় জয় জয়
There were other tunes, however, which came from classical Indian ragas, used for the first time in an operatic context. Valmiki Pratibha was staged in the Tagore residence with Rabindranath in the role of the bandit-turned-poet. The rest of the cast, too, was composed of members of the Tagore family, all gifted with varying degrees of talent for acting and music. Among those who saw and praised this performance was the greatest literary figure of the time, Bankim Chandra Chatterjee. A year later, when Rabindranath's Shandha Sangeet was published, Bankim Chandra personally congratulated the poet and acknowledged his preeminence among the rising writers of the day. Of all the members of Robi's family, two were closest to his mind and heart. They were Jyotirindranath and his wife. Kadambari Devi was 2 years older than Robi. She was his best friend and severest critic. Robi lived with these two for a time in a house in Sadar Street in South Calcutta. One morning, a strange experience befell the poet.
One day, while I stood watching at early dawn, the sun sending out its rays from behind the trees, I suddenly felt as if some ancient mist had in a moment lifted from my sight, and the morning light on the face of the world revealed an inner radiance of joy. The poem I wrote on the first day of my surprise was named The Awakening of the Waterfalls.
At the age of 22, Rabindranath married Bhavatarini Devi. The old-fashioned name was later changed to Mrinalini. 2 months before the wedding, Rabindranath had received a letter from his father in which he was asked to prepare himself to look after the family estates. After a period of initial training in the estates offices in Calcutta, Rabindranath found himself in the very heart of rural Bengal, in the region around the river Padma. With a worldly wisdom unusual in a poet, but characteristic of the Tagores, Rabindranath in later life set about in a practical way to improve the lot of the poor peasants of his estates, and his varied work in this field is on record. But his own gain from this intimate contact with the fundamental aspects of life and nature, and the influence of this contact on his life and work, are beyond measure. Living mostly in his boat and watching life through the window, a whole new world of sights and sounds and feelings opened up before him. In which the moods of people and the moods of nature were inextricably interwoven. The people found room in a succession of great short stories, and nature in an outpouring of exquisite songs and poems. Dominant was the mood of the rains, exultant and terrible.
হৃদয়ে মন্দ্রিল ডামর গুরু গুরু কালো মেঘের গুরু উঠিল গুঞ্জিত হলো রোমাঞ্চিত বন বনান্তর হৃদয়ে মন্দ্রিল ডামর গুরু গুরু তুলিল চঞ্চল বক্ষ হিন্দোলে মিলন স্বপ্নে সে কোন তীরে হৃদয়ে মন্দির ডামর গুরু গুরু সঘন ভাষণ শব্দ মুখরিত বজ্র সঙ্গীত দ্রষ্ট সর্বরি সঘন ভাষণ শব্দ মুখরিত বজ্র সঙ্গীত দ্রষ্ট সর্বরি আলোতে বল্লরি কাপায় পল্লব করুণ কল্লোলে কানন সংকেত চিল্লে সংকেত হৃদয়ে মন্দির ডামর গুরু গুরু কালো মেঘের গুরু কুটিল কুঞ্চিত হল রোমাঞ্চিত।
In 1901, Rabindranath was 40 years old. His already enormous output of poems and plays had been gathered in one big volume. It comprised 21 books and included Shonarturi, his first masterpiece. The same year, 1901, marked an event of a somewhat different nature. In Bolpur, in the district of Birbhum in West Bengal, Rabindranath had acquired some property in 1862, 1 year after Rabindranath was born. The property was made over to a board of trustees, and the deed specified that the place was to be used for meditation on the supreme formless being. According to the Maharshi's wishes, a seat of prayer and a temple of worship had been built, and close to the temple, a residential house which was called Shantiniketan, the abode of peace. Rabindranath had been worrying about the education of his children and had decided to start an experimental educational institution in Shantiniketan. It was to be a school, but not like the schools that had been the nightmare of his own childhood. It was to be like the forest hermitages of classical India. But to bring it into being was not an easy task. For one thing, it cost money. Rabindranath was obliged to sell, among other things, the copyright of his books. His wife added her bit by selling her wedding ornaments. 2 months after the school was opened, she was taken ill. 3 months later, at the age of 29, she died. For Rabindranath, it was the beginning of a series of personal tragedies. 9 months after his wife's death, his second daughter Renuka passed away. The hardest blow of all came 4 years later. Youngest son Shomindro took after his father in many ways. He was only 13 when he fell a victim to cholera. It was in the midst of these bereavements that Rabindranath participated in one of the greatest political upheavals in the history of India. In December 1903 was published the decision of India's Governor-General Lord Curzon to split up Bengal into 2 provinces. The idea was to create a separate province with the Muslim majority, which would induce a rift between the 2 main religious groups and avert the possible growth of a united front against the government. But in proposing the partition, Curzon merely fanned the flame of patriotism that had been smoldering in the minds of certain visionaries all through the period of the Renaissance in Bengal. These men now came to the fore and led the millions to rise in protest. The series of stirring and patriotic songs which Rabindranath composed for the occasion were sung in procession in the streets of Calcutta, with the poet himself in the lead.
তোমার দুয়ার আজি খুলে গেছে সোনার মন্দিরে ওগো মা ডান হাতে তোর খড়গ জলে বাহার করে শঙ্কা হরণ দুই নয়নে স্নেহের হাসি।
On October 16th, 1905, the partition became an accomplished fact. In a form of protest that only a poet could conceive, Rabindranath turned the Black Day into a mass festival of Rakhi Bandhan, the tying of the band of friendship.